Good afternoon, everyone. I am Eric Lufer, the President of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'd like to welcome you to the joint Citizens Research Council of Michigan and Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy webinar asking if Michigan's system of funding local government is broken. This is by far the most registrations we've had for a webinar, and so far the people that have joined us the most we've had attend, and we're all very glad you're able to join us. Michigan's local government systems collectively have had a hard time of it over the last 15 years. Starting in 2001, they suffered from reductions in state revenue sharing that resulted from the reprioritization of funds at the state level that shifted funding away from their statutory purpose to other state functions. And then starting in 2008, they suffered from the effects of the housing bubble burst, the foreclosure crisis, and the outmigration of people and manufacturing jobs. We are now about 7 years removed from what seems to have been the worst of the recession. Jobs are coming back, property values are picking up in some parts of the state. The state budget remains balanced, which may signal more consistent state funding in the future. Still, some signs of financial difficulty remain for some or all of our local governments. Revenue sharing is not rebounded to its pre-single state recession levels. Rebounds in property values will provide only some relief as constitutional property tax limitations restrain the ability of local governments to benefit from the growth. And cost pressures remain. With GASB's new standards relating to the accounting for legacy cost, a truer reflection of the true cost pressures will be shown on local government financial statements. Last week, we had the unprecedented action where 14 local governments have sued the state over the financing. Today, we offer two perspectives on the current state of Michigan's local government finance system. First, we will hear from our friends from the University of Michigan on the survey data they have collected on the perceived well-being of local governments. Upon the completion of their comments, the Citizens Research Council will provide a reflection on the survey results and offer some thoughts on the difficulties on meshing local government finance reforms with the survey respondents' preferences. The Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy, or CLOSUP as we often refer to them, is housed at the University of Michigan's Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy and conducts and supports applied policy research designed to inform state, local, and urban policy issues. Through integrated research, teaching, and outreach involving academic researchers, students, policymakers, and practitioners, CLOSUP seeks to foster understanding of today's state and local policy problems and to find effective solutions to those problems. You can learn more at closup.umich.edu. The Citizens Research Council of Michigan is a statewide nonpartisan public affairs research group. This is the Research Council's 100th year of operation, a longevity we attribute to our promotion of sound public policy for state and local governments through accurate, independent, and objective research. We are a private, not-for-profit entity, and we rely on the charitable contributions of foundations, businesses, and corporations. I'd like to encourage all of you to join our circle of supporters and help us to continue to provide high-quality, independent information on important policy topics in Michigan. You can learn more about the Research Council at crcmich.org. At the right of our website, you'll find an opportunity to sign up for our email distribution list to be notified about newly released papers. Allow me to introduce our speakers. Tom Ivacco joined CLOSUP at its founding in the fall of 2001 and serves as the center's manager and administrator. He also oversees the Michigan Public Policy Survey Program. Before joining CLOSUP, he worked at the University of Michigan's National Election Studies. He has a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's in public administration, both from U of M. Sarah Mills is a postdoctoral research fellow and project manager at the Center for Local, State, and Urban Policy. She received her PhD in urban planning from the University of Michigan in 2015, and her research focuses on policy in the state's rural communities. I am Eric Lufer. I am the president of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I have 29 years of experience with the Research Council, with most of that time being spent working with local governments. I've worked on city charter issues, state revenue sharing, property tax, intergovernmental cooperation, consolidation of local governments, and many other aspects of local government. Please note we are recording this webinar and we will post it on our website where it will be available for future viewing. Also, we have everyone but the presenters on mute, so we will not be able to hear if you speak. To ask a question, please type the question into the questions pane that should be appearing on the GoToWebinar dialog box. You can type these questions in at any time. If you experience any technical problems during the webinar, please let us know by calling 734-542-8001. Finally, after the webinar, you will receive an email soliciting your feedback. We would very much appreciate any feedback you have. With that, let me turn it over to Tom for their share of the presentation.
Thanks, Eric, and thank you all for joining us today. We've got a lot to cover, so I'm going to get right to it. The data from CLOSUP come from the Michigan Public Policy Survey, the MPPS. We want to start with a brief overview of that program so that you know how to interpret the data. The MPPS is a census-style survey. We contact all counties, cities, townships, and villages in the state, and we do 2 surveys per year. We've been very fortunate to get responses from more than 70% of these jurisdictions on most waves of the survey, which is remarkably high for survey research and gives us a lot of confidence in the data. The respondents are the chief elected or chief appointed officials, so positions like mayor or city administrator, county board chair or county executive, township supervisor, village president, and so on. And you can see here that the MPPS has covered a wide range of topics since we launched it in 2009. This is just a partial list. While we do cover a wide range of topics, one of the key features is that the MPPS tracks fiscal health issues every spring. And so we have built up a time series to start tracking changes over time. And we'll be looking at that information today. But before we dig into the data, we wanted to share this quote from a few years ago. Edie Kurtz, who was the emergency financial manager of Flint at the time, said, "Within 5 years, all of our urban cores are going to be where Flint is at today, unless significant changes are made. The way we finance cities today is broken." We at CLOSUP thought that was a particularly worrisome message from a well-informed insider, and unfortunately it sets the stage for the data we're presenting today. So here's a quick overview of CLOSUP's portion of today's presentation. We'll start by reviewing just a few of the key fiscal health indicators that we track each spring, showing that demands to provide services are increasing and costs to provide services are increasing, but revenues may not be keeping pace. To us, these findings raise the question of whether Michigan's system of funding local government is indeed broken. Then we'll review what local leaders think about Michigan's system of funding, and finally, what they think should be done about it. After that, Eric will review wider issues about funding options and how other states fund their local governments. Okay, let's dig into the MPPS data, starting with service needs and demands placed on local governments. This slide shows that the demands placed on local governments to provide public safety services, one of the core functions of local government, are much more likely to be increasing rather than decreasing over time. Each year since we launched the survey in 2009, on the left bar, many more jurisdictions, shown in blue bars above the 0 axis, have told us that public safety needs and demands have been increasing rather than decreasing, as shown in the red bars below the 0 axis. For example, as seen in the last bar on the right, in the 2016 survey, 33% of jurisdictions said that their public safety demands were increasing, while just 2% said they were decreasing. To state the obvious, when service demands placed on local governments are increasing, this introduces spending pressures on their budgets. Now, this is the exact same data, except that here we have added a line above the bars, which shows the percentage of Michigan's largest jurisdictions in terms of population size, who told us each year that the demands they face for providing public safety services have been increasing. You can see that the largest jurisdictions in Michigan are even more likely to face increased spending pressures compared to all jurisdictions statewide. This is an important point, and it's a common finding in the MPPS surveys. Michigan has a broad range of jurisdiction types, and they can be quite different from one another. we have 1,856 local jurisdictions. In relative numbers, a few are large, most are small, some are in between. They face different kinds of challenges and they'll need different kinds of solutions. We'll come back to that point again. On this slide, we see infrastructure needs and demands placed on local governments over time for all jurisdictions in the state. In 2016, on the right, 56% said that their infrastructure needs and demands were increasing, while just 2% said they were decreasing. We're not showing changes for the largest jurisdictions, but they too are higher at each point in time. For example, in 2016, 79% of Michigan's largest jurisdictions said their infrastructure needs were increasing. So those are just a couple of examples. We have many more, but for brevity, we're showing just a couple of the growing pressures placed on Michigan local government budgets because of the demands that they face to provide services. Now we'll turn to the costs of providing services. On this slide, we see that more and more jurisdictions are increasing the amount that they spend on infrastructure following those increased needs and demands we just saw. Looking back in time, we see that many jurisdictions put off infrastructure maintenance in the early years after the Great Recession. That's likely one of the reasons they now face increasing infrastructure demands and costs. You can only delay maintenance for so long, and the longer you do, the more costly it becomes to catch up later. Again, these bar charts are for all jurisdictions, and things look even worse for the biggest ones. We don't show it here, but in 2016, 64% of the largest jurisdictions said they were increasing their infrastructure spending, compared to the 42% that we see here for all jurisdictions statewide in the last bar. Here's another cost item, employee pay rates. Again, we see that in the early years after the Great Recession, relatively few jurisdictions were increasing pay rates for their employees, but as the economic recovery continued over the last few years, many more jurisdictions have been doing so. In 2016, 51% of all jurisdictions increased employee pay rates, compared to just 1% that reduced them. In the biggest jurisdictions, not shown here, 75% said they're increasing pay rates this year. So costs to provide services continue to climb.
Tom, can I interrupt you real quick? We have a question from the audience. Somebody wants you to define what you mean by large jurisdictions.
Yes, we break our jurisdictions down by the population size, and the largest jurisdictions include populations of more than 30,000 residents. As we said in the beginning, we see very significant differences when we break survey results down by population size, where the biggest jurisdictions tend to face more challenging circumstances, both on the cost side, the service demands, and the revenue side. Now on this slide, we're looking at the revenue side of the equation. So far, we've seen that local governments are facing increasing needs and demands to provide services and increasing costs as well. If the revenues are also increasing, that may be just fine. But if the revenues are not keeping pace, fiscal health is going to decline. So here we're looking at property tax revenues, the most important source of funding for local government, and one of the biggest drivers of fiscal stress resulting from the Great Recession and the housing collapse. In 2009, on the left side here, only 27% said their property tax revenues were increasing, while 48% said they were decreasing. Things got much worse in 2010, but then began a very slow recovery starting in 2011. Every year since 2011, things have been getting better, although at a very slow pace. But then this year, we found a reversal in that trend of continuous improvement. While 45% said their property tax revenues were increasing last year, that declined to 42% this year. That's not a huge drop, but it's still a red flag since it reverses what had been a 5-year trend, and it's especially worrisome since the economy has continued to improve over the course of the last year. Here's a similar trend in state aid to local governments, which is probably their second most important source of funding. Things were dire in 2009, but they got even worse in 2010, before a very gradual trend of improvement began in 2011. It wasn't until 2014 that more jurisdictions, 27%, reported receiving increasing state aid as opposed to decreasing state aid, which was reported by 21%. But just like with property tax revenues, in 2016 we found a reversal in that trend of continuous improvement that began back in 2011. Last year, 28% reported increasing state aid, but that fell to just 18% this year. So we've seen that demands and costs for service provision have been increasing and that revenues also began increasing in 2011, but only slowly. And then after 5 years of gradually increasing revenues, since the economy has continued to improve over the last 12 months, we were surprised to see revenues take a downward turn this year. All of those trends are reflected in this slide, which looks at whether local governments say they're better able or less able to meet their fiscal needs over time. This is one of our summary indicators in the MPPS surveys for tracking general fiscal health. The pattern here looks familiar. Things were really bad in 2009. Only 11% said their fiscal health was improving, while 52% said it was declining. Things got even worse in 2010, but then began to improve in 2011 and continued to do so, again, very gradually, each year through 2015. But in 2016, fiscal health overall turned, whereas 38% said they were better able to meet their fiscal needs last year. That decreased to just 31% this year. And here is the same slide, but here we've also charted Michigan's gross state product in the green line above the bars as a broad measure of the state's economic growth. We see that Michigan's overall economy has been improving each year since 2010. The figure for 2016 is estimated, obviously, but most analysts seem to agree that the state's economy is still growing and is expected to do so this year and next. And so here's the rub. Although Michigan's economy is continuing to grow, the MPPS surveys find that local government fiscal health, which had been improving for the last 5 years, has now reversed course. If the state economy is improving but local government fiscal health is not, this raises the question of whether Michigan's system of funding local governments is broken. So that's our quick review of the fiscal health indicators that we track each year. Now Sarah Mills will walk us through what local leaders think about Michigan's system of funding local government.
Thanks, Tom. The data that Tom just presented was drawn from spring MPPS surveys from 2009 through 2016. In addition to asking these fiscal health tracking questions, on the spring 2016 survey, we also did a deeper dive into local leaders' views of Michigan's system of funding local government. We had done this once before in 2012, but since we've seen movement in the economy in the interim, we revisited the issue and this time looked specifically at possible reforms to the system. Because, as Tom noted earlier, there are pretty substantial differences based on population size for many questions on the MPPS. Most of the slides that I will show first have data for all local leaders on the left and then have bars breaking data down by the jurisdiction's population size to the right of that. So first we have jurisdictions with less than 1,500 residents, 15 to 5,000 residents, and so on, until you get to the slide on the left, on the far right, which is those largest jurisdictions with more than 30,000 residents. I also want to note that this last group includes most of the state's counties, plus our larger cities and townships. So for the data on this slide, we can see that just 40% of local leaders statewide believe that their jurisdiction will be able to maintain the current quantity and quality of services it provides, even if the economy improves gradually over the coming years. This is down 3 percentage points from when we asked the question in 2012, again, despite economic improvements in the interim. In the state's many smaller jurisdictions, which tend to provide a limited set of services, there is more optimism that the system will allow them to maintain services going forward. But you can see that once you're in jurisdictions with more than 10,000 residents, those jurisdictions that also tend to offer more services, a majority of local leaders say they won't even be able to maintain services going forward. When we then asked local leaders if they would be able to improve or add more services, now there's much more pessimism among jurisdictions of all sizes. Overall, only 23% of local leaders say the system will allow them to add or improve services in the future, and almost half, 46%, say the system won't provide adequate funding for such improvements. And you can see that big majorities of the state's larger jurisdictions say they won't be able to make improvements. Among the cities, counties, and townships with more than 30,000 residents, 76% of local leaders say the system won't enable them to make improvements. So it's probably no surprise that a majority of local officials think the system of funding local government is broken and in need of significant reform. When we asked this question, overall 64% told us they believe the system is broken, and more than a quarter, 28%, strongly agree that it's broken. By contrast, just 3% strongly disagree that the system is broken. This slide shows the same data but in a different format. I've combined the strongly agree and somewhat agree categories above the zero axis and the strongly disagree and somewhat disagree categories below the zero axis. And I've also added the data on the left from when we first asked the question in 2012. In the last 4 years, while the overall economy has shown improvement, belief among local leaders that the system is broken has actually grown 6 percentage points, from 58% in 2012 to our current 64%. Here you can also see that the percentage that think the system isn't broken has shrunk by 4 percentage points in that time. I also wanted to note that this is not a particularly partisan issue. We have solid majorities of both Democrats and Republicans who say the system is broken. Here, 59% of local leaders who self-identify as Republicans and 72% who self-identify as Democrats say it's broken. And among those who say they are independent, 80% say the system of funding local government is broken and in need of significant reform. Finally, this is also an issue that's relevant to jurisdictions of all sizes. The largest jurisdictions are the most adamant that the system is broken, with 87% of local leaders in these communities answering that way. But we also have 60% of local leaders from the smallest governments who also feel the system is broken and in need of reform. So what do they want to see done? When the MPPs first asked about the system of funding local government in 2012, we asked local officials to suggest some reforms to the system. Their suggestions included changes to specific provisions within the Headley Amendment and Proposal A, as well as suggestions that would give local governments more latitude to raise revenues from other sources. On this year's survey, we presented local officials with 11 of the possible reforms that had previously been suggested, and asked them to rank their top 3. Here you can see those 11 reforms, and you can see that 2 clearly stand out from the rest. 75% of local officials say that compelling the state to pay for unfunded mandates is one of their top 3 priorities. 70% report that restoring full revenue sharing is also on top. In third place, you can see reforming the Headley Amendment's millage rate rollbacks, followed by reforming Proposal A. The remaining reforms are relatively indistinguishable in terms of their ranking as a priority, but as you will see, there are pockets of support for most of them. Okay, so going back to that top priority, compelling the state to pay for unfunded mandates. This is a reform that is supported by large majorities of local leaders in both large and small jurisdictions. 98% of local leaders from the state's largest jurisdictions support this, but so do 75% in the smallest jurisdictions. This is perhaps unsurprising given what an impact unfunded mandates have on local government budgets. By some estimates, these mandates cost the local governments more than $2.2 billion per year. Looking at the next reform, restoring full statutory revenue sharing, overall 76% of local leaders support this. This is another big ticket item, as state cuts to revenue sharing payments from 2002 to 2016 amounted to an estimated $7.5 billion being diverted in that time period. And again, there is the most support among largest jurisdictions, but also very strong support in the state's smallest jurisdictions. There's also support by a majority of local leaders for reforming the Headley Amendment to eliminate or limit property tax millage rate rollbacks. We see 57% support this statewide. As you likely know, because Headley's inflationary cap has limited year-over-year growth of property tax revenues to just minor annual growth rates. Even though property values have grown substantially in many locations following the Great Recession, the rollbacks have not allowed property tax revenues to rebound. And so it's unsurprising that we have so many local leaders from jurisdictions both large and small supporting this reform. For the rest of the reforms that I'll discuss, we don't see a majority of all local officials supporting the reforms, but they are still supported by a majority of officials in the state's largest jurisdictions. Notably, though, among the smaller jurisdictions, there isn't necessarily high opposition. Instead, we had many local officials tell us they were ambivalent about these lower priority reforms, or didn't know how they felt about them. A good example of this is on another reform to Headley, establishing automatic millage rate roll-ups, which is shown here. Overall, 44% of local leaders support this, compared to just 20% that oppose. You can see that there is more support than opposition for jurisdictions of all sizes, but we don't have majority support until you get to jurisdictions with more than 10,000 residents. Instead, if you look at the smallest jurisdictions, you can see that just over half of local officials had an opinion one way or the other. That leaves 40% of local officials in these smaller jurisdictions who are on the fence or just don't know how they feel about millage rate roll-ups. Another option that has been floated in the past is reforming Proposal A to allow more taxable value growth on individual properties. Again, overall, there is more support than opposition. Statewide, 43% of local leaders support this and 22% oppose such a change. And there is more support than opposition in jurisdictions of all sizes, but we only have majority support among local officials in communities with 5,000 residents or more. Again, in the smallest places, there isn't so much opposition as ambivalence. The MPPS also asked about increasing the maximum allowable local millage rates. Here there was 42% and 16% opposition statewide, with, again, lots of ambivalence in the smaller jurisdictions. And we see a similar pattern for increasing the rates on state taxes with revenue sharing components, such as the state sales tax or the state gas tax. Statewide, 39% of local officials say they would support raising rates on these state taxes, while 24% say they would oppose such increases. And finally, here's a slide with a bit of a different story to tell. We asked whether local leaders would like more latitude from the state to raise revenues through new local option taxes, like a local sales tax or a local gas tax. Overall, 34% of local leaders support enabling these local option taxes, while 26% oppose. But you can see pretty big differences based on population size. This is the only option where there is more opposition than support amongst the smallest jurisdictions. You can also see that almost half of local leaders in these small places were ambivalent about such a change. By contrast, there is a relatively strong majority support for enabling local option taxes in jurisdictions with more than 10,000 residents. We followed up on this question by asking local officials if they were given the flexibility to levy new local option taxes or increase their millage rate, would they do so? We presented them with 9 possible local revenue sources. Here you can see that 34% said they would not pursue any new local revenues. About 2/3, 66% of local officials said they would support pursuing some new local revenue. But notably, only 31% would pursue more than 2 new local streams, 2 new local revenue streams, and just 3% said they would be willing to pursue all 9 options. Again, we do see some differences based on population size. In the smallest jurisdictions, which tend to offer fewer services, here is where 38% of local officials say they would not pursue any additional revenue. By contrast, in the largest jurisdictions, only 21% of local leaders said they wouldn't raise any additional local revenues. However, even in these largest jurisdictions, less than half say they would pursue more than 2 sources. So clearly, if Lansing were to give new authority to local governments, we would not likely see an explosion of new local option taxes. Also importantly, there is no clear consensus on which new local option tax would be best. The highest support is for increasing the local property tax millage rate. That's the tried and true option on the list. The next option in line is for having a local sales tax on alcohol or tobacco, something that's often referred to as a sin tax. But here you can see that more local leaders say they would oppose levying such a tax than would support levying one. And perhaps even more notably, if you look at the bottom of the list, an outright majority of local leaders say they would not be willing to levy a local income tax, local motor vehicle registration fee, local gas tax, or a local sales tax. So wrapping up, our 8 years of data on the MPPS Fiscal Tracking Survey shows the worst of the Great Recession, a gradual trend of improvement, but now, for the very first time, a reversal in that trend. Our additional questions this spring about Michigan's system of funding local government finds that even though the economy has improved since we first asked these questions 4 years ago, more local leaders now say the system is broken compared to 2012, and fewer say they can maintain or improve services going forward under the current system. There is statewide consensus on 3 reforms to the system, all of which really put the ball in Lansing's court: compelling the state to fund mandates imposed on local governments, restoring full statutory revenue sharing, and reforming the Headley Amendment's millage rate rollbacks. In the state's largest jurisdictions, where most of our residents live and where there are many more services offered by the local government, there is actually majority support for 9 of the 11 reforms, a clear sign that these local leaders are willing to put all of the options on the table to reform the system. Again, looking statewide, 66% of local governments are willing to raise additional local revenues if they are given the discretion to do so, but there is no consensus on which options are best. Some want to be able to increase their property tax millage rate, while others would levy a sales tax on alcohol and tobacco. What is clear from our research is there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Clearly, more discussion is needed between state and local officials if we are going to be able to address this complex and pressing problem. And with that, I will turn things back over to Eric.
Thank you, Tom and Sarah. So we have a number of questions in already, and I encourage everyone to continue to type them in as we go. We're going to pose these questions that have been asked so far to Tom and Sarah after I do my presentation, so as not to lose any time there. A few people have the virtual hands raised, and I want to let you know we're going to try to do everything by having you type in your questions rather than speaking them. It just has worked better for us that way in the past. So that's what we're going to try to do. So now let me react to the CLOSUP survey. Some of the key findings that I heard as I listened to Tom and Sarah go through their share of the presentation: local government officials are reporting cost drivers with public safety needs, infrastructure, and wage escalation. Local government officials do not see property tax revenues or state revenue sharing dollars growing. For the first time in 6 years, a decreasing percent of respondents said available revenues are not sufficient to meet needs. Only about 40% said they will be able to maintain current service levels, for which many are already below the levels of services provided prior to the Great Recession and our single state recession. And 64% think the municipal finance system is broken. The survey then asked about preferences for revenue supplements that we just heard Sarah talking about. So that is what I want to focus my comments on. The 2 alternatives receiving the highest levels of support call on the state to do something different: increasing state revenue sharing and funding unfunded mandates. There is some support for doing fixes in the property tax system, and fewer respondents supported seeking authorization for local option taxes. Why is that we've put so much emphasis on the state doing something different? Is it because we have a lot of long-timers that remember the promises that were made when the state revenue sharing system was developed and when the Headley Amendment was adopted by the people? Or is it because they've given some consideration to the difficulties of levying local option taxes? We must also note that the CLOSUP survey is a census survey, so they receive responses from leaders in small communities as well as large, with little service delivery responsibilities. The cost of imposing a local option tax and the economic disruption one might create may seem as outweighing any benefits from revenue growth. Let's begin by focusing on the idea that if the state lived up to its promises, local government finances might not be in this condition. Michigan has a long history of the state sharing revenues with local governments, much of it unrestricted in its use. The origins of that program are twofold. Some revenue sharing relates to the state promises to repay local governments that have been for property tax loss of the local tax base that has been exempted by state legislative action. A bigger portion is revenue shared to aid local governments. The state had options when revenue sharing programs were implemented. It could have returned revenues to the jurisdictions from where they were collected. In essence, this would have made the state the collection agent for local taxes. Instead, taxes were returned on a per capita basis and to address differences in fiscal capacity. By doing it this way, the state has redistributed dollars throughout the state. When we look back at history, although there have been a few years in which state revenue sharing was what we would call fully funded, the shortages in the past were often very minor and incremental. Recent history is less forgiving. We see here the trends in constitutional state revenue sharing. A set percent of sales tax revenues, according to the Constitution, are shared with local governments, and so as the sales tax revenue has trended up, so has constitutional state revenue sharing. This pot of money has grown about 3.5% per year since 2010, which again is the base of the growth in the sales tax revenues. This money is distributed on a per capita basis, so it benefits small governments more than larger urban districts on a proportional basis. So when we think about the survey respondents for the CLOSUP survey, you would expect smaller local governments who are relying almost exclusively on this constitutional state revenue sharing to be indicating that the revenue is trending up. This is a chart showing the trends in statutory state revenue sharing. Since the 1970s, the state has attempted to get funding to the governments with the greatest needs. The authorization and directions for doing so were written into statute, not the Constitution, so they have been subject to change. To deal with the single state recession and then the Great Recession, the state has used this latitude to divert funding to other state needs. As a result, about $6 billion have been diverted, and the program only sends funds to our largest cities and townships in the state. Now, if I put those two together and add in the share of state revenue sharing that statute suggests should be going to local governments, that's the black share of the bar on the top, we can see what's been going on. Survey respondents said that when we look at the survey respondents then from the CLOSUP survey, we can sense that where you stand depends on where you sit. Local small governments and townships generally enjoyed the annual growth in the constitutional state revenue sharing. But the bigger governments are looking at the black portions of these bars and lamenting what they could have done with those funds had they been provided. Why did this happen? Well, if we look at trends in state general fund growth since 2000, we can get a sense for why the state policymakers have made some of the decisions they've made. What we see here in the orange bar is the actual revenues flowing into the general fund, general purpose state budget. You can see that it started at about $10.68 billion back in 2000, dipped during our single state recession, dipped further with the Great Recession, but has trended up since then, and we expect it, given our consensus revenue estimates, to trend up again in the next couple of years. But even then, by the year 2018, it will not have recovered to where it was in the year 2000. If we then look at the blue bar, the blue line, that is inflation adjusted dollars. And we can see that the state is doing much of what it has been doing in the past with less resources. And given the budget pressures it has had with corrections, with Medicaid spending, with its attempt to keep school funding whole, and many other pressures on the state budget, the state revenue sharing has been the pot it has looked to address its needs. So a number of CLOSUP respondents said this is our top priority. We need to fund state revenue sharing. Well, what does the future look like? We see on this chart a number of colors, and I'm going to walk you through what each one represents here. The blue line is the expected general fund, general purpose growth over the next couple years. You can see that there's a few years of growth that we expect in the near future, but by 2018, 2019, and 2020, that should flatten out. The orange bar is what the expected revenue that will be needed to pay local governments for foregone personal property tax revenues. You recall in the year 2012, we had actions at the state level, and then in 2014, a ballot question asking whether personal property taxes should be exempted for the most part, and should the state make local governments whole to implement that. So that orange bar is what's going to have to go to local governments to keep the local government, and will be coming out of state funding. The gray bar and the yellow bar represent revenues that will be gone because of our road funding package that was adopted at the end of last year. The gray bar for I lost my train of thought there. The gray bar for the income tax that's going to be lost, and then the homestead credit is the yellow share of it. So what about the state funding unfunded mandates? The notion of unfunded mandates is not a new one. States complain about unfunded mandates from the federal government, and local governments complain about unfunded mandates from the state. As part of the balance in creating both state and local tax limitations in the Headley Amendment, provisions were included to protect against unfunded mandates and against the state cutting payments to local governments as a means of living within its own limitations. Local governments have had little success in getting relief under Section 29. The key hang-up is that the courts have sided with the state to say that the requirement only qualifies as a mandate if it applies to all local governments in a class. That is to say, it has to affect the spending of all cities, all counties, or all school districts, and so on. So we see that school districts are better able to identify such mandates than local governments because education is a state function delivered at the local level. Our local school districts are performing a function that is being defined by the state and performing it on the state's behalf. We only have 2 cases that have gone in the favor of local governments in the 38 years since Headley was adopted, and both have benefited school districts. Now we can see that counties perform many functions on behalf of the state as well, but most of the county mandates are mandated by the state constitution, and the courts have not thought that those should fall within this provision. So we can think about those with our prosecutors' offices, our courts, our welfare functions, and so on. Laws applying to cities, villages, and townships say that if the government chooses to perform a function, it has to live within that requirement. As a result, many things local governments view as mandates do not fall within the very narrow judicial definition. We've seen examples of this with firefighter gear. The state might require a certain level of use of coats, the breathing apparatuses and things like that, but the courts have said you're not required to provide a fire department, and therefore these do not qualify as mandates. Same thing has been seen with landfill environmental protection or water treatment. You're not required to do those things, so they don't qualify as mandates under the provisions of the Headley Amendment. In order for this to change, we'll need a new definition of a mandate. Ideally, this would happen with a statutory change, but this is clearly not in the state's interest. It could happen with a new judicial ruling, but that would require local governments endeavoring on a very expensive quest that may not yield any fruit. Or it could come with a voter-initiated statutory initiative, but that would be even more expensive and require a lot of voter approval, as well as persuasion that it will not increase the cost of government. We heard Sarah talking about property tax reform. Property taxes account for about 92% of own source revenues for local governments in Michigan. This means that local governments are especially dependent on them, but it also means that property owners feel overburdened by them. This sense of overburden has led to a number of tax limitations over the years. Two are most significant here. Section 31 of Article 9 was added to the Constitution by the Headley Amendment. It limits the growth in property tax revenues on a jurisdiction-wide basis to the rate of inflation. It allows for the levy of new taxes or increases in the tax rate beyond what was previously authorized only with a vote of the people, and it allows for restored taxing authority in the case of tax rate rollbacks with a vote of the people. The Headley Amendment provisions worked on a jurisdiction-wide basis, but they did not protect individual taxpayers. So we might have seen on a jurisdiction-wide basis the revenues only growing at the rate of inflation, but one taxpayer might have experienced a 20% increase while another had a 1% increase. So when we got to 1994, there was still an appetite for doing something about the increases in property tax growth in the tax base. And Proposal A included a cap on the growth of assessments for individual parcels. The assessments are benchmarked to 50% of true cash value at the very beginning, and then again when parcels change hands with change in ownership. But in between those benchmarkings, the property tax base is limited in growth to the rate of 5% or the rate of inflation, whichever is less. And we have seen since 1994, it has always been the rate of inflation. The cumulative effect of these two tax limitations has been troublesome. We have seen in most years, if we don't look at the Great Recession and the housing bubble burst and so on, that about 95% of properties are not changing hands on a regular basis, and so they're only growing at the rate of inflation. But that leaves in most jurisdictions about 5 to 10% of the properties that are changing hands and are then rolling up or popping up to the SEV, the true cash value of that property. Those pop-ups cause a tax rate rollback under the Headley Amendment. That is, the tax rate is reduced to such a millage so that the net result is an inflationary growth in the property tax revenues. That lower rate is applied across all properties, even those that did not change ownership. And this is really where the rubber hits the road and where a lot of local governments are finding problem with our property tax system. The response receiving the third most support in the CLOSUP survey was to modify the tax rate rollback provisions in the Headley Amendment, to which some have asked if anyone would notice. They point to the state education tax, the SET, which is levied on a 6%, 6 mil basis on the same tax base as our local property taxes. And we can see that the statewide tax base has grown faster than the rate of inflation several times since enactment. Yet the tax rate has remained the same. Has anyone clamored why the state education tax has not been rolled back? I think most of us don't even notice. It just goes on. So we can see that taxpayers are enjoying tax restraint from the taxable value limits on the growth of the tax base, and the fact that the tax rate is being reduced in minuscule amounts has not been really noticed for most taxpayers. And it really begs the question whether we continue to need both of these tax limitations. Well, let's think for a second then about what about these ideas for tax reform, for the tax alternatives. Let's start with some of the other property tax reform ideas. As I mentioned, a lawsuit was filed last week alleging that the state has used faulty accounting to violate the Constitution. Because the school funding reform efforts in 1994 amounted to a tax shift, the suit alleges that the funding should not, the increased funding should not be counted as aid to local governments. The suit alleges that charter schools are not units of local government, and therefore school aid dollars sent to them should not count toward the state fulfilling its requirements. It also alleges that funding sent to county road commissions or cities and villages to perform work on MDOT roads should not be counted. Finally, it says that any money that the state is paying to fulfill mandated services should not be counted. All of which amounts to the fact if the 14 cities suing the state win, the state will need new revenues to fulfill the requirements under Section 30. But even absent this lawsuit, it's possible to address Section 30. Local governments could initiate a constitutional amendment to change the year upon which the ratio is based. Many would recommend 1996, a few years after Proposal A, as a year that we should benchmark to choose how revenues have grown. Because this is written into the Constitution, it would require constitutional amendment, and we all know that requires a great deal of efforts to circulate petitions or convince the legislature to put the question on the ballot, and then a campaign effort to make that happen, to get the voters, to convince the voters that this is a good idea. Another Headley-related reform relates to tax rate roll-ups. When the amendment was first adopted, tax rates could be rolled back or rolled up. If inflation was greater than the growth in property tax values, or a unit experienced negative growth in values, then the math would work the other way as it currently does to return some previously authorized tax rates that had been lost to earlier tax rate rollbacks. For many years, this provision had little value. Finally, it was eliminated about the same time that Proposal A was adopted in 1994. But we can see by doing the math now that it would have played a pretty major role in lessening the pain for local governments over the past dozen years as property values have declined. This change could be done statutorily. Local governments suffer in the taxation of commercial property and sometimes industrial property from court and tax tribunal cases that limit how properties may be assessed. The WPW case said that vacant storefronts cannot be assessed at full value if the building was not fully occupied and used. The problem is once the taxable value is reduced, it can only grow by the rate of inflation. We also have a recent phenomenon called dark stores that relates to the idea that certain buildings are built to meet the needs of a particular owner. If that owner moves out, the next owner may have to clear the land before the property can provide value. Thus, the property should be worth less and assessments are decreased. Big box stores have used this argument with success. These assessment rules do not amount to a major change in the taxable value of the state, but they are very significant to the local governments in which the properties are located. Local government associations are pushing for statutory reform to remedy these issues. Reform will mean that we need to look at some of the tax incentives available to local governments for economic development purposes. Again, about 92% of local government's own source revenue comes from property taxes, and the only new revenues come from developments because of the tax limitations I described before. So, in order to attract new development, local governments are using these tax incentives that allows tax abatements to be offered, decreasing the amount of new growth to about half of what it otherwise would be, or they're using tax increment financing to enhance the area and provide the amenities that the businesses need to move into the area, which means that all new growth is being captured to be used for economic development and pay for those amenities. The state gains with the new development with increased income taxes, sales tax, and other revenues, but the local governments are asked to give up. Finally, we think about the fact that the CLOSUP survey talked about Proposal A allowing more growth. Well, if we look at the provisions of Proposal A, it says that the tax base can only grow at the rate of inflation or 5%, whichever is less. Since 1994, that 5% maximum has never come into play. We have always used the rate of inflation. So it's not quite clear what we would do to allow greater growth in the tax base under that, and whether you could convince the voters that they should pay more than the rate of inflation if something were done. That would require a constitutional amendment. So let's think about some of the tax alternatives that were offered. Before I jump into some of them, I raise the issue of who would levy such new local option taxes. If we think about our cities and townships, we can identify that there's about 1,700 of them that would be potential taxing jurisdictions. Michigan, with its townships, cities, and villages, is very balkanized. And so if we were to have local option sales, income, motor fuel, liquor taxes, and each jurisdiction was free to implement it at whatever rate they chose. Usually the state law sets a maximum but doesn't dictate the exact rate. You can imagine the turmoil, the economic disruption it would create, as well as the confusion for businesses trying to negotiate this labyrinth. What if we did it at the county level? We see a lot of other states authorize these taxes at the county level. But I think doing so would really raise the spectacle of the mismatch we currently have between those under the scenario that would raise the revenues and those delivering most services. Cities and townships are doing most of the service provision in Michigan. This is really where the rubber hits the road. Counties are very valuable, but they're doing a lot of things that we don't always notice. Hopefully you don't have to deal with the criminal justice system. Hopefully you don't have to deal with the welfare system or things like that. And because many of our counties continue to operate with a governance structure that's a vestige of the 1850s, many of our residents don't have a great deal of confidence in the services that are being provided by our counties, the governance structure that's overseeing them. Now we could have the counties raise the revenues through these taxes and distribute them to the local governments, but that would raise as many issues as we go through at the state level about how those revenues should be shared back to the local governments. We look at other states and we see that they often employ regions to levy some of these taxes. Local option taxes, especially sales taxes, will be levied on a regional basis to pay for zoos and transit and many other things. But these other states have created a democratically elected system of representatives governing the regions. And so we're choosing the people to govern our regions. In Michigan, the closest thing we have to regions are what we just redesigned the state. They're called Michigan Prosperity Regions. But these are voluntary associations of businesses, local government leaders, civic leaders, from inside and outside of government. We haven't elected them to represent us on these regional boards, and so I don't think that would quite work going forward. Let's explore some of the options. First, we have the local option income tax. 12 other states authorize local governments. In Michigan, only the cities are authorized to levy the local option income taxes. So counties, villages, school districts, none of them have the opportunity to do this. The adoption for this tax and all other taxes I will mention requires voter approval, so you can't just choose to do that. We have the 22 cities that currently levy it, but there's been many others that have looked at this option, and either the city councils have chosen not to put it on the ballot. They've done the math and don't think it will be a big enough help to warrant the question, or they've put it on and the voters have told them no thank you. Many cities, as you can see, 34 different states authorize local option general sales taxes. The issue in Michigan is very troublesome for local governments who want to consider this option. First, we have put in the Constitution limits on the sales tax rate. In total, no more than 6%. The Constitution requires the state to levy a 2% tax to fund schools, and it permits another 4% that the state, of course, is currently levying. So suppose you could persuade the state to forego part of its 4% and allow local governments to levy that. Then you would have to deal with the other part of the Constitution that dictates that funds are sent to schools and state revenue sharing. So the state grants to our local governments, say 1% to levy on a local option basis, but then that local unit finds out that almost 73% of the revenue is going to go to schools, and another 15% is going to go to all other local units of government throughout the state. So even if local governments could levy the tax, they wouldn't get much of the revenues. And we would have to deal with this option, first with requiring a constitutional amendment to increase the permissive rate, have to get legislative authorization for local governments to have this option, and then local governments would have to get voter approval. CLOSUP asked about local option hotel or tourism taxes. We of course have these already. They're levied at the county level. There's two different acts that authorize this, one for Southeast Michigan to fund the Cobo Center, and another for counties under 600,000 to finance different entertainment or attraction purposes. The Southeast Michigan tax continues to be levied and will be levied as long as the debt is outstanding for the Cobo Center. And as of 2015, only Calhoun, Genesee, Ingham, Kalamazoo, Kent, Muskegon, Saginaw, and Washtenaw counties levy the other tax. The issue perhaps is that cities, villages, and townships in no way benefit from those, do not directly benefit from those taxes. We have 10 different states authorize their local options to their local governments to levy local option motor fuel taxes. Michigan, I'm not aware of any serious effort to authorize local option motor fuel taxes. To do so, it's certainly possible, but we would have to reconfigure the way we tax motor fuel now. Currently, it's taxed at the wholesale level, so as a truck is leaving the refinery, bringing the tax out to the different stations, the tax is applied, and we know it's going to be sold in Michigan. It's just done at that level. We could move to a retail tax. That's certainly possible, and I'm sure that's how these other states are doing it. As we consider that option, we'll want to think about the fact that it's not a very productive tax. In order to get enough money to really make a difference, local governments would have to levy the tax at a 10 to 15 cents per gallon. And we have to think about the fact that a local tax would suffer from many of the same weaknesses that the state tax suffers from. People are driving less, cars are more fuel efficient, lighter cars means less motor fuel is being consumed. And again, we would have to take this question to the voters. 34 states authorize their local governments to think about motor vehicle license taxes. Michigan has tried this in the past. From 1987 to 1992, counties were authorized to levy a flat rate fee of $25 per vehicle, regardless of the weight of the vehicle. So if you're driving a Ford Pinto or a Lincoln Town Car, you are going to pay the same amount. Votes were held in Alpena, Eaton, Monroe, Montcalm, Oakland, and Tuscola counties, all without success for the counties hoping to benefit from the new revenues. 15 states authorize local option alcohol beverage sales taxes. You can see most of those are east of the Mississippi River. Again, Michigan does not currently authorize this. There has not been any effort that I'm aware of to do this at the local government, to allow local governments to do this in Michigan. Certainly it could be done with our Liquor Control Commission. We certainly know now where the liquor is being sold, how much volume, so on. So this is a path to go down. And as you think about where alcohol is being sold, we know that many of our urban areas, many of our vacation destinations all would benefit from such a tax. Again, Sarah mentioned that this is a sort of a sin tax that people tend to favor a little more. We would have to think through the details of whether we would differentiate at the restaurant sale versus a store sale, as our state tax currently does. We heard about the local option tobacco sales as part of the CLOSUP survey. 9 different states authorize this. We don't have any record of trying this in Michigan. Again, we should be able to, given our current system, know where the tobacco is being sold, have some idea of how to implement a local option tax. Again, this is a sin tax, so might be better able to gain voter approval. And then there's 43 states that authorize local option public utility sales taxes. In Michigan, only the city of Detroit is authorized to levy this sort of tax on public telephones, electric, steam, gas service. It would affect almost all properties, so this would not fall solely on businesses or solely on residential properties. As we think about it, though, we have to acknowledge that it's not proven to be a very robust tax for the city of Detroit, whether that is due to the economics of the city of Detroit or the tax itself would require some greater study. Again, it would require voter approval as we move forward. So what are the takeaways? I think as we think about what CLOSUP said, clearly there's evidence of a broken municipal finance system, and it's becoming real for more and more local government officials. But as I hope you can take away from my comments, fixes will not be easy. The state does not have funding or an inclination to fund state revenue sharing, it would seem as we read the tea leaves. The state has little interest in funding mandates passed down to local governments. As we think about some of the most effective Headley Amendment fixes, it would seem that they would require a constitutional amendment, and there's certainly cost and difficulty associated with that. And any consideration of alternative revenue sources shine a bright light on the mismatch between optimal revenue-raising level of government and the levels of government responsible for providing key services. So with that, let me turn on the microphones for Tom and Sarah again. And we'll look at our questions. All right, so the first one, most of these from the beginning will be related to the close-up part of the presentation. Daryl asked, while there may be increasing property tax revenues, that doesn't tell the full story. Revenues may be increasing at a rate lower than cost, so it is important to ask local units if property tax revenues are keeping pace with cost. This is likely not happening generally, but there may be exceptions. Has the question been framed this way? That is, has it been asked if revenues are keeping pace with expenditures?
That's a good question. We have not asked the question exactly that way on the MPPS surveys. We track a pretty wide range of fiscal health indicators, whether property tax revenues are going up or down, whether state aid is going up or down, federal aid, revenues from fees and services, and so on, and a pretty wide range of types, whether it's employee pay rates, employee fringe benefits, spending on different kinds of services. So we track a lot of individual indicators. We don't ask specifically, are revenues keeping pace with costs and demands? That's actually a pretty good suggestion I think we'll consider going forward.
A clarifying question is, you, in your vernacular, as you thought about, you mentioned state aid, is that dealing generally with all state aid, or is that a different way of saying state revenue sharing?
The question itself is asking about state aid overall, not just about revenue sharing. To be honest, it's probably likely that some officials may be focusing primarily on revenue sharing. They may not get many other types of state aid. In larger jurisdictions that get a wider range of types of revenues, they would be thinking more broadly than just revenue sharing.
Is it largely the same jurisdictions that are captured in the blue bars versus the red bars, or are some jurisdictions moving from inclining to declining or declining to inclining ability to meet needs? In other words, how many communities are facing a chronic, years-long worsening in the ability to meet fiscal need?
That's a really good question, and this is something that we need to do a little more research on ourselves. Now that we have the longitudinal data going back in time, we hope to do some research on jurisdictions that have been in what we call persistent fiscal decline. We've looked kind of quickly at some of the data, and I guess what I would say is there certainly are jurisdictions that move up and down. One year a jurisdiction may say that their fiscal health is improving, and subsequently they will tell us that the opposite has happened, that now they're having a down year. So there is movement within the MPPS data, but overall I think what we found is jurisdictions tend to be on one track or another, broken down three ways. Those jurisdictions that tell us their fiscal health really hasn't changed tend to the next year say the same. Jurisdictions that say their fiscal health is improving tend the next year to say it's still improving, and those who say it's declining the next year tend to say it's still declining. So we're seeing jurisdictions kind of segregated into those three groups, but there is certainly movement between them.
Another clarifying question. In the unshown percentage, does that reflect neutral or does it reflect no response?
That would reflect people who tell us either that there's been no change or that they don't know. For no response, for a jurisdiction that simply doesn't answer the question, they would not be included in the 100% calculation. They would be excluded from the figures entirely. So on some questions, I think there's not much difference between a don't know and a no preference, or possibly in some cases no particular change from the previous year. In these presentations that we've been going over today, we're focusing just on those who say either things are going up or down, or that they approve or disapprove. In particular, I think in the later slides that Sarah presented, where we asked about opinions on reform for for the current state system of funding local government, and about opinions on potential new local option taxes, we see not much difference between responses of don't know versus no preference one way or another. Those are people in our mind that are kind of open to the question. And I think that's kind of an important point in the data that we gathered, which is for a lot of these options, whether it's reform of the existing state system and or it's the more detailed responses on local option taxes, there are significant percentages of local leaders who say either I don't know what I think, if it should be changed, and or say I don't have a preference. Those are folks who are open to discussing this further, and I think on some of these things that we dug into, there probably are issues of even more education needed, even among some leaders who may not deal with a particular tax. And so as they learn more about the pros and cons of reform, they may fall in either the pro or the con side of that coin. And that's why we say in the report we released today that we think what's needed next is an ongoing focus on these issues and much more discussion.
Sarah asked, what are the characteristics of jurisdictions that can cover their needs? The sort of the can. How do they know if they can?
That's a good question. So it's just a very broad question that we put to local government leaders. Is your jurisdiction better able or less able to meet its fiscal needs this year compared to last? And so that covers a very broad set of individual indicators. They'd be thinking about things like, is their general fund balance in okay shape, or is their fund balance too low? And if they have some unforeseen emergency fiscal need, would they be in a position to deal with it? Whether their revenues from property taxes and aid and so on is going up or down, and costs. So this is one of the summary questions that we ask that get at fiscal health, and local leaders would be thinking about a really broad set of issues related to it. For what it's worth, that question comes from a similar survey that the National League of Cities conducts, where they do surveys of larger cities across the state, across the nation. We borrowed this question from their survey so that we could compare responses in Michigan to what's happening across the nation.
Rex asked me a question I'll take here. You can rest your voice. What do we know about the fiscal health of local government finance in relation to their use of tax incentives, abatements for economic development? Are those local governments that frequently award tax abatements to private businesses better off or worse off fiscally than those that make fewer tax abatements? Rex, what we've seen in the past, there's a group of researchers from Michigan State, Eastern Michigan University, and Wayne State did a study a couple years ago and found that the tax abatements in Michigan are used very frequently in Southeast Michigan by local governments that sort of have suffered from the blight and the abandonment, that they have the opportunities to award these, and it's sort of the half a loaf is better than a full loaf. Not a lot of people banging on the door to get to those properties. It has been used elsewhere in the state, and what we've seen in the Grand Rapids area is sort of a judicial use of the tax abatements to draw in the type of businesses they're looking for on a very strategic way. We also looked at the use of the tax capture, and this is a little more troubling, we think. When those tax captures were first authorized with our downtown development authorities and local development finance authorities, their intent was very strategic to help blighted communities to turn things around. The Citizens Research Council just published a survey of economic development programs and described these programs and looked at who's using them. And we listed in our appendix every community that authorizes, has one of these special authorities that allow for tax capture. And using a fairly small font, our list of communities goes on and on and on for pages. Clearly more communities are using tax capture than we have blighted communities. So I think addressing both your question about tax abatements as well as the question of tax capture is something that's the time has come. Another question for our friends at CLOSUP: has CLOSUP ever queried elected officials about the benefits of Headley Prop A during the first several years of a downturn by keeping taxable values higher than they would be without Headley or Proposal A?
That's a good question. We have not specifically asked from that kind of perspective in that time frame. If we're in position in the future, that's certainly something we'd consider having a focus on.
And a question from Marcel about how this data will be used to inform our term-limited legislators. So Tom and Sarah, what happens with your reports? And then I'll talk a little bit about the Citizens Research Council.
Well, the first step is what we're doing today, getting this report out to as broad an audience as possible, working with colleagues such as CRC, which have a great statewide network of stakeholders paying attention to these issues. We send our reports to every state legislator, so those emails went out this morning first thing. And I guess we'll see if we get any kind of interest from state legislators asking for more details about these issues. We certainly are always willing at CLOSUP to to respond to any requests for further information. We put all these reports certainly onto our website. We're sharing all of our data now through a data archive at the University of Michigan, ICPSR. So anyone's able to download these data sets and do additional research on their own. And we try to work through the media to get these kind of findings out to the general population as well, so that if citizens or other stakeholder organizations, foundations, think tanks, and so on have an interest in these issues, they're informed. So we are ready to respond to any requests for further steps on this, and we'll see what comes our way next.
And on behalf of the Citizens Research Council, all the work we do is posted on our website, and through our email distribution, we attempt to get that into the hands of legislators, into the hands of their staff. I think we have a fair amount of success in doing that. Even term-limited legislators in their time there become aware of the work we do. We have been active with a group going throughout the state, helping them to explain to the citizens, to local government officials, what's happening with our municipal finance system. All of that is coming together to help legislators understand the issues. And we have a forthcoming report looking at our loss and property tax base that, again, will be available to everyone, but we're going to try to help our legislators understand particularly what has happened with the Great Recession, with the loss of property tax base, the fact that this remains an issue going forward. Tom asked of me, is the Citizens Research Council supporting or in some way being an informational statistical advisor to the group of municipalities that are currently suing the state? So the Citizens Research Council has acted as a resource to help that group understand municipal finance, understand the state funding. We have been doing the work on an ongoing basis to follow state trends in spending, follow school funding and whatnot. So we have been a resource, and we would be the same resource to others that come asking these questions. It's nothing particular about this group. They asked and we answered. But we are in no way endorsing the lawsuit or anything of that nature. It was simply helping them to understand. So Tom and Sarah, Tricia asked, this survey was only focused on revenues and what locals need or demand, but it doesn't address spending at all. Will you be doing a survey asking detailed questions about how locals spend money and what are they doing to curb the biggest cost drivers, skyrocketing cost of unfunded liabilities, pensions, healthcare, benefits?
Yeah, we actually put out a report just about a month ago. That's available on our website. It's our annual Fiscal Health tracking report. And in that, we track both revenues and expenses and other issues related to fiscal health. Over the last number of years, we have put out additional reports looking specifically at employee-related expenses, whether local governments are increasing or decreasing their number of employees, whether they're increasing or decreasing spending on public safety services, human services, infrastructure spending, whether they are negotiating with their employee unions to try to get concessions, whether they are shifting more of their pension and retiree health care costs to be paid by their employees and so on. So we track a pretty wide range of issues related to local government spending, and those are always included in our annual fiscal health reports, which come out every year just about this time, but then also in occasional other reports looking at pretty specific aspects of major sources of spending, such as employee benefits and retiree benefits.
Charles asked, would local tax increases drive people from large jurisdictions to lower population areas? Given the disparity in property tax bases, should there be consideration of tax equalization measures across jurisdictions? Well, Charles, I think this is what we've been seeing for many years in Michigan, why we have an out-migration from our urban core communities, Detroit, Flint, Grand Rapids, Saginaw, many of the cities that once upon a time were homes to businesses and people, and now we are trying to figure out how to revitalize these areas. It was exactly the fact that there was high taxes and over time loss in service quality that people have moved into greener areas, and we've experienced urban sprawl. The issue now, you suggest tax equalization across jurisdictions. The question posed to Michigan residents is, are they willing to, now that they've moved out to greener pastures, are they willing to pay for the services for those they've left behind? I think we're going to see this not for the first time, but in a big way with the question posed in Southeast Michigan this November on the Regional Transit Authority and whether Wayne, Oakland, Macomb, and Washtenaw counties are willing to tax themselves to provide an enhanced level of transit throughout the communities. People aren't generally, they've often moved away from these areas out to the townships, out to low tax areas, a bigger lot, more space, and lower taxes. Are they willing now to pay higher taxes because it's going to benefit the whole region? Tom wants to weigh in.
I think from the MPPS survey data, one aspect of this question that kind of came through to us is where we see local leaders expressing the greatest amount of support for fixing the system of funding local government focused at the state level as opposed to the local level. Significant widespread support to fund unfunded mandates, significant widespread support to restore full statutory revenue sharing, and major support also to reform Headley rollbacks. All of those would raise more revenue at the state level to then be redistributed back to the local level. By comparison, relatively little support for introducing those local option taxes. So our reading of this is local government leaders are not that anxious to raise additional revenues locally. They get voted into office as well, and I think are probably somewhat reticent to go to their own citizens seeking lots of new revenues, and would prefer those revenues be collected at the state level and distributed back, if indeed they would be distributed back, which has not been happening as it should have been according to the Constitution.
Sarah asked, the survey shows that jurisdictions can't meet their needs, but can you talk a little bit about scale, not just the number of jurisdictions, and which is true. Obviously, being short $1,000 is different than being short $1 million.
Yeah, actually, we'll, if you can still see the screen here, I'm going to take us to our CLOSUP website, and we have all of these pre-run data tables on our website. So we'll go to the 2016 survey, and this is the responses for whether jurisdictions are better able or less able to meet their fiscal needs compared to last year. And we'll scroll down a little bit and see the breakdowns by population size. These are our smallest jurisdictions in the 1500 column, and over here is the largest jurisdictions in Michigan. So in terms of the scale, overall, only 3% of jurisdictions tell us they're significantly less able to meet their fiscal needs this year. Another 19% are somewhat less able, so a total of 22% are less able this year. 31% are better able to meet their fiscal needs. Overall, only 4% significantly better able. So we don't see wild swings, statewide in terms of fiscal health going up significantly or down significantly in a short time frame. But there are some jurisdictions that experience, more significant changes than the average.
Ray asks, can you explain what you mean or where you get your data to say that smaller communities offer less services? It may be the situation where small communities offer many of the same services just on a smaller scale, but proportionally the same cost or higher proportional cost to their budget. So Ray, I'm happy to follow up with this offline, but generally what we see is that the amount of services provided by our local government tends to be in proportion to the density of the community. The closer people live to one another, the closer their houses are, the closer businesses are to one another, the more services are offered and the greater the intensity of the service. So while fire protection is offered pretty much throughout the state without fail, when we get to our urban areas, our highly dense communities, there we're going to see bigger fire trucks able to do more things, more hazmat type things. The police services are offered at a higher level. If you're in a rural community, you might take your refuse to the dump. In urban areas, we often have garbage trucks come around and collect them. So it's not a one-to-one relationship, and if I implied that, I didn't mean to do so. But generally, our bigger communities, our urban areas where people are living in closer proximity, the local governments are doing more to serve the needs of their residents in those areas. Question from Jim. Local governments don't want to be competing with each other within the state. Creating more local taxes is not efficient, and the state should administer centrally. An income tax increase statewide that is constitutional and distributed by the state is more of what is needed, or the state should just return the SSR of income tax, I assume the state revenue sharing. Can your future survey include things in this line?
Yeah, I think we can ask questions certainly about some additional follow-up on the questions we've asked today. My gut sense is, based on what we've seen, I think a lot of local leaders would agree that they think some of these revenues should be collected at the state level, whether it's because of efficiency, you have one collection agency as opposed to 1,856 of them, or for other reasons. I think a lot of local leaders would agree they would prefer to see revenues collected at the state level and distributed back locally. They just don't trust anymore that the state is in fact going to share those revenues back after they've collected them.
So Bill asked, you address public safety, infrastructure, and wages in the rising cost section, but not legacy costs such as pensions. How did communities rate based on whether they were a defined benefit or defined contribution?
We did not look at that specifically within this report, but we have asked in the past whether jurisdictions believe that their pension and OPEB retiree healthcare obligations are a significant fiscal problem for their jurisdiction or not. So that's something we track. We did not break these data down in today's report according to those. I think probably what we'd see if we did is that those jurisdictions that are facing severe fiscal challenges because of retiree obligations would be even more so in support of these fiscal reforms, and probably the broad range of them, both reforming a wide range of revenue sources at the state level and having more authority at the local level to raise additional local options.
All right. Jay asked, would exempting new improvements to property from Headley rollback calculation require a constitutional amendment, or could the legislature enact this change? Jay, I don't want to pretend to be a lawyer. The devil is always in the details, but the legislature does have some latitude in what is being included as new, how it defines new development, and I think much of it could be done legislatively. Again, the devil is in the details, so I don't want to overspeak here, but that's the direction we would go. We have a number of questions about the slide deck, and I want to let people know that it is on our website. CLOSUP, it'll be on the CLOSUP website as well. On our website, you can click on the resources tab and there's presentations. This will be the top one you see there, and you can get that. And this whole thing is being recorded, and the recorded session will be linked to from both of our websites as well. So another question or bit of advice about your survey at CLOSUP. Can future surveys have more trade-offs? The state needs to hear what we are willing to trade off.
This is Sarah speaking now. That's certainly something that we will consider for inclusion in the future, and something that we do try to include in the past. One of the questions, for example, that we put on this survey included the trade-offs between increased taxes and service provision. And so that is something that we have asked and can imagine expanding that in the future.
One related aspect of that is in today's report. We didn't present it here in the webinar, but we asked local leaders whether they think their citizens would support paying more taxes in order to avoid service cuts at the local level, or would they prefer to deal with service cuts locally in order to avoid paying higher taxes. And what we find is most local government leaders think their citizens don't have much of an appetite to pay more taxes at the local level, except for the core services of public safety, so police and fire in particular, maybe for some infrastructure such as roads, but even there it's more questionable. But once you get beyond those core functions of local government and you get at things like parks and recreation and libraries and so on, local leaders don't think their citizens are willing to raise their own taxes to pay for service improvements. And so that partly Sarah had mentioned in her part of the presentation that if Lansing were to enable local governments to levy additional local option taxes, we don't think that there would be some kind of explosion in these things happening in communities across the state because local leaders just don't think their citizens have the appetite to do that locally.
All right. If I missed any questions in here, we will try to follow up offline. I think that is going to be our last question. So Tom and Sarah, any parting thoughts?
Thank you all again for for taking the time to do this today. If you have any questions or would like just more information, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. You can go right to our website, CLOSUP. There's no E in that. CLOSUP.umich.edu, and we'd be very happy to follow up on any questions.
And with that, I will echo those thoughts. Thank you all for attending. I hope you benefit from it. Again, we appreciate your support and certainly are willing to address any issues offline if you have any thoughts, any other questions, want to pursue that. I hope you all can enjoy this beautiful day, and we look forward to interacting with you the next time we do this. Have a good day.